July 6, 1943, 04's 40 hours, south of the village of Pokrovka, on the southern face of the Kursk salient. Morning mist clung low to the ground, hanging in slow-moving clouds over wheat fields, crushed flat by tank tracks. General Hermann Papa Balk stood beside the command half-track of the XL-8 Panzer Corps, binoculars raised, scanning the dark ridge line 2 kilometers ahead. He had barely slept, just 3 hours after a full day of combat in which German armored spearheads of the Wehrmacht and SS Panzer Corps, plus the panzer divisions under his own command, had destroyed more than 200 Soviet tanks in swirling engagements along the Pisel and the approaches near Cherkaskoye. But even now, in the quiet between artillery duels, Balk sensed the next phase building. Radio intercepts from the previous evening suggested the Soviets were repositioning entire tank corps, 2nd Guards Tank Corps, 2nd Tank Corps, and elements of 31st Tank Corps, into a counterattack posture. German aerial reconnaissance, even limited by smoke and Soviet camouflage nets, had identified long columns of T-34s moving west during the night. The Luftwaffe pilot's estimate, hundreds, was vague, but Balk knew the meaning behind the ambiguity. The Soviets were concentrating for a blow far larger than anything his corps had faced on July 5th. At 0442 hours, the ridge flashed white. Soviet artillery, on 152 mm howitzers from the Voronezh front, opened fire with a precision that startled even veteran observers. Shells landed in tightly spaced brackets across German staging grounds, ammunition dumps, and assembly points for the 11th Panzer Division. Balk snapped his binoculars downward as one shell erupted just 400 meters from a column of Panzer Feuerwehrs preparing to move. He saw men diving off half-tracks, mechanics dragging fuel hoses away from burning puddles. The barrage was heavier than anything the Soviets had fired the previous day, faster, more coordinated, less exploratory. At 0444 hours, the front line lit up again, this time not from artillery but from hundreds of tank engines igniting in unison behind the ridge. Balk could hear the roar carrying across the wheat fields, a deep, layered mechanical growl, unmistakable to anyone who had fought on the Eastern Front. A Soviet tank attack of enormous scale was beginning. He lifted the binoculars again. Through drifting smoke, silhouettes appeared, first a few dozen, then rows, then masses. T-34s, many with infantry riders clinging to the turrets. Behind them, the square shapes of KV-1s and Su-122 assault guns. The ridge was alive with movement, hundreds of vehicles cresting in disciplined waves. And the artillery was still falling. Balk checked his watch. It was 0445 hours. The sun was not yet fully risen, and the Soviets were already committing more armor than he had assumed they would deploy in the entire southern sector of the salient. He muttered a single sentence to his operations officer. This is the decisive counterstroke. As the first Soviet tanks rolled downhill, the scale became clear. This was not the 200 armored vehicles smashed the day before. This was the next morning, and nearly 1,000 Soviet tanks were massing for the largest armored assault Balk had ever seen. The disaster or triumph of Kursk, of the entire southern offensive, would hinge on the next hours, and everything that had brought Balk's forces to this point had been shaped by months of preparation, thousands of rail cars of supplies, and a battle plan built on assumptions that were already collapsing under the pressure of Soviet industrial power. Hermann Balk was one of Germany's most capable frontline generals. A veteran of World War I, he had commanded at battalion, regiment, brigade, and division levels, with a consistent emphasis on mobility, aggressive counterattacks, and flexible use of combined arms. By 1943, he was leading the XL-8 Panzer Corps, which formed the left prong of the German southern assault during Operation Citadel, the massive pincer movement designed to cut off the Kursk salient. Operation Citadel had been planned since April 1943. It was meant to be Germany's answer to the deterioration of the Eastern Front following Stalingrad and Kharkov. Hitler and the Army High Command envisioned a lightning attack using newly reconstituted armored divisions, equipped with improved tanks like the Panther AUSF, D and fortified by heavy battalions operating Tiger I tanks. These formations, supported by artillery, Luftwaffe air support, and mechanized infantry, would punch through Soviet defenses and collapse the salient before the Red Army launched its own summer offensive. But Citadel was plagued from the start by delays. Production problems with the new Panther and Tiger tanks pushed the offensive back repeatedly. Originally planned for May, then June, it finally launched on July 5th. This delay allowed the Soviets to prepare one of the most formidable defensive systems ever constructed. The Kursk salient was protected by 3,000 kilometers, or 64 miles of trenches, 400,000 mines in the southern sector alone, 20 anti-tank belts, hundreds of artillery positions, deep reserves of infantry, tank armies, and mechanized corps. Soviet intelligence, through intercepted communications and the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, knew the likely timing of the German attack. Even without exact dates, they anticipated an offensive in early summer. The Voronezh and Central Fronts, commanded by Generals Vatutin and Rokossovsky respectively, constructed layered defenses that were designed not to stop the Germans outright, but to bleed them, destroying tanks, consuming ammunition, wearing out maintenance crews, and forcing the Germans to expend fuel reserves faster than they could be replenished. Balck's corps, consisting primarily of the 11th Panzer Division, the Grossdeutschland Division, and attached heavy tank battalions, was tasked with the western flank of the southern attack. His forces were among the best trained in the German army, but even they faced enormous challenges in breaching the Soviet defensive lines. On July 5th, the first day of Citadel, German troops attacked at 04:30 hours. The Soviets had preempted the assault with a massive artillery barrage of their own at 02:40 hours, disrupting German assembly areas and damaging communications. Despite this, Balck pushed forward, his divisions fighting bitterly to advance through dense minefields and entrenched Soviet positions. The Grossdeutschland Division's Panther Regiment, fighting its first major battle, experienced catastrophic mechanical failures. Out of 184 Panthers committed, more than 90 broke down on the first day due to engine fires, transmission breakdowns, and track issues caused by the heavy mine belts. Only a fraction of the Panthers remained operational by nightfall. This left Balck increasingly reliant on veteran Panzer IV units and the elite Tiger tank battalions, whose 80mm guns could destroy a T-34 at well over 1,500 meters. The Tiger's firepower helped the Germans destroy over 200 Soviet tanks in intense engagements during the afternoon and evening of July 5th. German gunners exploited the mixed terrain of wheat fields and shallow rises to set up long-range ambushes, and their superior optics allowed them to detect Soviet armor before the Soviets detected them. One famous engagement that day occurred near Cherkasskoye at approximately 1600 hours. A Soviet tank brigade attempted to counterattack the German advance. Balck's artillery shifted fire rapidly to break up infantry support, while his Panzer IFAs dug into hull-down positions, fired into the flanks of the advancing T-34s. Tigers from Schwer Panzer Abteilung 503 joined the fight, picking off Soviet tanks at ranges where the T-34's 76mm gun was ineffective. By the time the sun set at 2130 hours, Germans under Balck's command had destroyed more than 200 Soviet tanks, and the Sueten SS Panzer Corps, fighting east of him, reported similar numbers, but victory on the tactical level masked deeper problems. The Germans had penetrated only the first 2 of 7 major defensive belts. They had lost dozens of tanks to mines, mechanical breakdowns, and Soviet anti-tank guns. Ammunition expenditure was far higher than expected. Some panzer companies ended the day with fewer than 20 rounds per tank. Fuel reserves were running low, with supply columns forced to navigate roads under constant Soviet air attack. Most importantly, the German timetable for the offensive had already slipped by several hours. The second day of Citadel would involve fighting not exhausted enemy remnants, but fresh Soviet units. And those units, massive, armored, and fully supplied, were already moving. At 2200 hours on July the 5th, Balck received intelligence from aerial reconnaissance and ground intercepts that the Soviets were repositioning tank corps westward during the night. The scale of this movement was unnerving. Entire brigades were observed moving in columns tens of kilometers long. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps, with approximately 200 tanks, was moving into position. The 31st Tank Corps, with another 250 tanks, was also reported. Behind them, 2 mechanized corps and additional reserves from the steppe front were preparing to enter the battle. This was the difference between German and Soviet operational planning. German panzer divisions were concentrated elite units with limited reserves. The Soviets, by 1943, operated on a scale built through extraordinary industrial output. T-34 factories in Gorky, Chelyabinsk, and Nizhny Tagil were producing tanks in numbers Germany could not match. By mid-1943, Soviet industry produced approximately 1,200 T-34s per month. German industry, by comparison, produced fewer than 300 Panzer and 60 Tigers per month. This industrial imbalance was reflected in the battlefield reserves available to each side. While Balck commanded around 500 tanks across his sector, including Panthers, Panzertiefs, and Tigers, the Soviets opposite him had access to more than 1,500 operational tanks across the Voronezh Front's reserve lines. Balck knew all of this. He understood that his success on July 5th, destroying over 200 tanks, was only a start. The Soviets had enough armor to repeat such losses for days. As midnight approached, he walked along the lines where Grossdeutschland's grenadiers were dug in. He spoke quietly with officers, asking about ammunition, casualty rates, and expectations. Officers estimated rifle companies at 50-60% strength after a day of intense fighting. Artillery crews reported shortages of smoke shells and high explosive rounds. Panzer crews were exhausted, having fought for 16 hours with minimal rest. Yet the order was clear. continue the advance at dawn. The Soviets had different plans. At around 0300 hours on July 6th, Soviet radio traffic suddenly increased. Ground-level reports indicated that Soviet tank corps were finalizing their deployment on the high ground around Pokrovka and had begun positioning assault guns and anti-tank brigades. Infantry from the 6th Guards Army advanced to mine new fields in the dark. Soviet engineers laid additional anti-tank guns along likely German approach corridors. By 0400 hours, the before-dawn quiet was shattered by the opening artillery salvos described in the hook above. As Balk watched the ridge erupt with movement, he realized the truth. He had not won yesterday. He had been fighting only the screening elements of an enormous Soviet armored concentration. And, on the morning of July 6th, those forces were advancing all at once. The largest tank battle of the southern Kursk offensive was about to begin. The Soviet barrage reached full intensity at 0447 hours, rolling across the German front in deliberate, mapped-out patterns. Balk immediately recognized the technique. Pre-registered kill zones, executed by well-trained Soviet artillery divisions that had learned, through brutal experience, how to open a mechanized assault. Shells exploded along German communications trenches, over supply vehicles attempting to distribute ammunition, and across the forward staging grounds where repair crews worked through the night to restore damaged panzers. Every concussion meant disrupted plans, broken timetables, or wounded crewmen. Time, measured in minutes, was slipping away before the tanks had even clashed. At 0450 hours, the first wave of T-34s crested the ridge. They descended in staggered formations of platoons and companies, hulls low, engines roaring at maximum RPM. Some advanced at over 40 km/h, kicking up sheets of dust and ash from burned-out armor scattered across the ground from the previous day's fighting. The leading elements belonged to the 2nd Guards Tank Corps, nearly 200 tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by infantry from the 6th Guards Army. Their mission was clear: break the German attack momentum, force the XE Panzer Corps onto the defensive, and open the road for deeper Soviet reserves waiting behind. Balk knew the German line could not absorb such a blow without immediate counteraction. At 0453 hours, he radioed 11th Panzer Division. Panzergruppe forward. Immediate engagement. Within minutes, Panzer IVs began rumbling toward the forward slopes, their 75mm L-48 guns loaded with armor-piercing rounds. Tiger Lorn tanks from Schweer Panzerabteilung 503 moved in behind them, engines straining against the incline. At 0502 hours, the first German shots rang out. A Panzer IV platoon fired at 1,200 meters, knocking out 2 leading T-34s. The Tigers joined seconds later, their 88mm guns punching clean through Soviet glasses plates at nearly 2 kilometers. Through his binoculars, Balk saw T-34s erupt in flashes of white and orange, gun turrets blown open, ammunition igniting, snow and wheat chaff thrown skyward. But there were too many. For every Soviet tank burning on the slope, 3 more advanced. At 0515 hours, a second wave, this one from the 31st Tank Corps, appeared behind the first. Another 200 to 250 tanks, including KV-1 heavy tanks and Su-122 assault guns, poured over the crest. The battlefield was transforming into a sea of armor, hundreds of vehicles moving with coordinated aggression, unimpaired by the catastrophic losses of the previous day. Balk understood immediately. The Soviets had committed not one corps, but multiple tank corps in echelon. This was not a local counterattack. It was a major operational strike, timed to meet the German spearheads when they were at their point of maximum vulnerability. At 0530 hours, the fighting reached its first critical point. German panzers engaged in long-range duels, but Soviet tanks kept closing the distance. Once they reached 800 meters, their 76mm guns became far more dangerous. Even if the T-34 could not reliably penetrate a Tiger frontally, it could, and did, destroy Panzerfoes, half-tracks, and anti-tank guns. German infantry companies, depleted from the previous day, struggled to hold their positions under the weight of Soviet fire. At 0540 hours, Soviet artillery shifted its barrage forward. A curtain of high-explosive shells erupted in front of the advancing tank columns, suppressing German infantry dugouts and blinding AT gunners. Behind this rolling barrage came Soviet infantry, thousands of men advancing in waves, riding on the tanks or running close behind for protection. The German defensive belt began to buckle. Balk responded decisively. At 0550 hours, he ordered a counterflanking maneuver using elements of the Grossdeutschland Division's Panzer Regiment. These units, veterans with extensive mobile warfare experience, maneuvered into firing positions south of the main Soviet thrust. Their unexpected appearance rattled the Soviet left flank. T-34s began to shift orientation, slowing their attack momentarily, but the Germans could not exploit this interruption. Soviet reserves were vast. At 0605 hours, the third wave struck. This assault, launched by the 2nd Tank Corps, was even larger, over 300 tanks and self-propelled guns, supported by 2 mechanized brigades. They attacked slightly farther east, threatening to roll up German lines from the side. German radios crackled with urgent calls for help. Pioneer Battalion overrun. Panzerjäger guns silenced. Enemy tanks in the rear trenches. Request Luftwaffe urgently. The Luftwaffe, however, was already struggling. The Soviets had achieved near parity here on the southern front. Yak-9 and LA-5 fighters patrolled the skies aggressively. German Ju-87 Stukas, that had once dominated early war battles, were now vulnerable to dense Soviet anti-aircraft fire and constant fighter interception. The airstrikes Balk needed to disrupt Soviet formations were late, scattered, and too few. At 0615 hours, a column of roughly 60 T-34s smashed into the right flank of the 11th Panzer Division. German defensive guns, including POC-40s, fired rapidly. One gun knocked out 6 T-34s before being overrun, but the weight of armor crushed their positions. German infantry fell back, counterattacked, then fell back again. Balk ordered 2 Tiger platoons to plug the gap. The Tigers advanced, firing at high tempo, their thick frontal armor absorbing hits that would have destroyed lighter vehicles. They stopped the Soviet thrust for several minutes, but the Soviets had hundreds more tanks behind them. At 0630 hours, Balk climbed atop his command half-track for a better view of the battlefield. It was a chaos of movement. Dust clouds, burning tanks, exploding ammunition, men running between craters, ambulances weaving through shell fire. The wheat fields were shredded by tracks, fires, and shell bursts. Soviet infantry waves were approaching under the cover of their armor. The Germans had inflicted enormous casualties, yet the Soviets continued pressing forward as if the losses were irrelevant. For the first time that morning, Balk saw the full scale of the Soviet attack. Nearly 1,000 armored vehicles engaged directly or moving into position. No German corps on the Eastern Front, not even the elite SS divisions attacking east of him, had the strength to withstand such mass for long. At 0640 hours, the battle entered its decisive phase. Soviet tank brigades pushed into the gaps between German panzer groups. Their objective was no longer simply to halt the German offensive, it was to break apart the Exil Panzer Corps entirely and collapse the southern pincer effort. Balk responded with a bold maneuver, a counterattack designed to buy time. At 0645 hours, he ordered the remaining operational Tigers and Panzer IVs from Grossdeutschland to form a concentrated wedge and strike directly at the lead Soviet tank brigade. The Germans advanced, guns blazing, closing the distance to exploit their better optics and crew coordination. Several dozen T-34s were destroyed in the first minutes. The Soviet forward elements wavered, and for a brief moment it appeared the German wedge might regain initiative. But then Soviet anti-tank brigades opened fire from hidden positions. Dozens of 45mm, 57mm, and 76mm guns fired simultaneously at the advancing panzers. Hits peppered the thinner armor of German medium tanks. 2 Panzerweifers erupted in flames. A Tiger sustained a direct hit to its track and ground to a halt. The German counterattack stalled. At 0710 hours, the Soviets committed yet more reserves, this time Su-152 heavy assault guns, firing 152mm high explosive shells. These Zveroboy, beast killer guns, were among the few Soviet weapons capable of destroying a Tiger frontally. Their shells, traveling at lower velocity but carrying enormous explosive power, could break turret rings, smash optics, or shear off track assemblies with a single hit. 2 Tigers were disabled within minutes. At 0730 hours, Balk realized the German offensive timetable had disintegrated completely. Instead of attacking toward Prokhorovka, the ex-Alpha-8 Panzer Corps was now fighting for its survival. He issued a new order: shift to defense in depth, conserve ammunition, buy time for the Kaudun SS Panzer Corps to advance in the east. But the Soviets were not finished. At 0745 hours, nearly 200 more T-34s from rear echelons moved into the engagement area. The battlefield, already crowded, became a moving mass of steel, smoke, and fire. German units began to report critical shortages, panzers down to 10 rounds each. Artillery low on charges, ammunition trucks hit, fuel columns caught by air attack. These were not tactical problems, they were systemic failures. German logistics, already stretched by delays and attrition, could not support a battle of this scale, even if Balk's formations could destroy another 200 or 300 tanks. They had no operational reserves, no fuel buffer, no replacement vehicles. The Soviets, by contrast, had more tanks en route from the steppe front. Industrial output made the difference. Soviet factories, operating day and night, had given their commanders the ability to absorb losses that would break any German corps. At 800 hours, the Soviets pushed within 400 meters of Balk's command position. He relocated his half-track twice under heavy fire, issuing orders as he moved. His calmness under pressure kept the Corps from dissolving, but even he could not alter the arithmetic of the battle. At orders wait 30 hours, German lines began to stabilize slightly around several defensive knots formed by surviving tanks and anti-tank guns. The morning peak had passed. The Soviets had lost dozens, perhaps hundreds of tanks. But so had the Germans. Many of Balk's best companies were reduced to platoon strength. Maintenance crews were overwhelmed. Medics worked frantically under fire, and the Soviets still had reserves. Between Oro 900 and 1200 hours, the battle raged across a shifting 4-5 kilometers front. Neither side gained decisive ground, but the Germans were bleeding strength rapidly. Their mechanized cohesion, the essence of blitzkrieg, was collapsing. By early afternoon, Balk submitted a stark assessment to Army Group South. Offensive momentum lost. Severe armored losses. Enemy reserves unlimited. By the night of July the 6th, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans had fought with extraordinary skill, destroying hundreds of Soviet tanks. But they could not overcome the mass, logistics, and operational depth of the Red Army. The next day, July 7th, marked the beginning of the slow German retreat in the southern sector of Kursk. The offensive would grind on until July 12th, culminating in the titanic clash at Prokhorovka. But its strategic failure had already been sealed. The lesson of July 6th was unmistakable. A corps can win battles, an army can win campaigns, but only a nation's industry can win a war. The Germans had crushed 200 tanks on the first day. The Soviets simply replaced them overnight. And when 1,000 T-34s rolled forward on July 6th, the Eastern Front shifted decisively toward the Red Army's iron weight. Thank you for watching this World War II story. Like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.